move on with a bit of an introduction. The person I would like to introduce you is our keynote speaker. It's Kadri Aavik, who is a PhD and an associate professor of gender studies at Tallinn University, and whose keynote speech will be about how men are expanding the circle of compassion, about vegan men, and what they can show us about care. So, Kadri, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for this kind introduction. And good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are joining us from. And I would like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting to give me this keynote speech. It's really an honor to be able to open this conference on men, masculinities and care. And delivering this keynote certainly is a unique experience, especially today, as we are located outside academic settings. We're actually doing this from a recording studio under blazing lights today. And but it does look that these virtual conferences are becoming our new normal for many of us. And I do want to thank the organizers for taking seriously our safety and at the same time making it possible for us to hold this conference. So within the next hour, I'll be sharing some insights on men and masculinities and care based on my ongoing research focusing on vegan men. So they are men who have given up animal products from their diets as well as beyond. And I propose that veganism can constitute one tangible way for men to cultivate and practice greater care towards non-human and human others, as well as the environment and the self. And I'm aiming to speak no more than 50 minutes or so to leave some space for questions and discussion. And I also will try to speak a little bit slower than normal because we have a translation from English into Estonian. And I hope that my slides are visible to you. So this talk that I'm going to give you today is based on an upcoming book chapter in this great book anthology, which is titled Men, Masculinities and Earth. And this is edited by Martin Haltman and Paul Poulet. And I know that Martin, I think, is also participating in this conference, and there are other contributors who may be listening. So hi there, if you are listening now. But now, shortly before going into the main topic, I'd like to mention briefly the background of this research that I'll be telling you about today. Currently, I'm involved in a research project at the University of Helsinki, and this is titled Climate Sustainability in the Kitchen, Everyday Food Cultures in Transition. And this project examines cultural change towards more sustainable ways of living and eating. And specifically, we focus on plant-based food and veganism. And gender and intersectionality are key perspectives through which we look at these issues. And there's also an activist orientation to the project, so we do have a practical outcome as well. We have developed climate-friendly vegan recipes, which are mainly targeted at large kitchens and canteens. But now, to move on to the topic of my talk, I'll start by shortly stating some maybe more obvious, but also some maybe a little bit less known information about where we are as humanity in terms of the condition of our natural environment, but especially focusing on how we treat other species and how this links to our own well-being as individuals, as societies, and what are the implications for social equality. And you may already imagine that this may not be a very pleasant or hopeful information, but as I will be pointing out, there are ways in which we can reshape our relationship to other life around us. So I'll start by a few comments on human-animal relations and social and environmental justice in the Anthropocene. So as we all know, we live in this era termed the Anthropocene, where humans are really profoundly changing the Earth's biosphere in ways that are detrimental to our ecosystems and all life on Earth. And at the same time, on the social front, we are facing a number of social challenges, amongst them rising inequalities. Now, it has been established by now that this current global crisis, ecological crisis, is largely driven by humanity's consumption of other animals on an industrial scale. And this has reached really extraordinary dimensions globally. So farmed animals are actually making up 60% of all mammals on Earth. And also, more than 70 billion land animals are killed for food annually. So these are quite staggering numbers, and they point to a profound ethical crisis in human-animal relations. This crisis has very institutional dimensions. So we've got this, what we can call animal-industrial complex, so these industries all together. And this is a speciesist social institution, and it is upheld by governments and supported by private businesses as well as individual consumers. And often when we hear those very staggering numbers that I just quoted, they really don't help us very well to connect with the fates and lives of individual animals in that system who are routinely harmed and exploited to satisfy human taste buds mostly. So the harmful consequences of consuming other animals on our ecosystems have been increasingly recognized, and this is quite well known by now. Also by some quite mainstream organizations. And it's been estimated that animal agriculture is responsible for between 18 to 51% of all greenhouse gases that humans produce. And it also uses a lot of land, so 70% of all agricultural land and 30% of all land on the planet. But what I want to kind of look closer at, so beyond these quite devastating impacts on that animal farming has on other animals and the environment, there's quite a typically overlooked but a very crucial aspect to the consumption of other animals. This has damaging consequences on human beings as well, and particularly, I mean, more vulnerable groups and communities. So I just have a few examples here. So when we think of jobs in slaughterhouses, this is some of the most dangerous kinds of work, and with high risk of injury, stress, trauma, as well as poor pay. And in many countries, this is performed mostly by racialized and ethnicized people, so quite vulnerable groups. And also, when we think of climate change more broadly, it overwhelmingly impacts more vulnerable countries and communities, and we can be looking at climate refugees already now or very soon. So there are many more examples like this, and if we are to strive towards a truly equitable and sustainable world, so we have to take seriously and challenge our treatment of non-human animals. And this should involve moving beyond our anthropocentric thinking and also include species in our thinking, including in feminist research. So what are some ways out? So I'm going to talk a little bit about moving towards more ethical and sustainable food practices. So it's quite clear that we need to do something in this situation. And also in academic discussions, actually, we have been talking about this for already decades. So we have in feminist research, we have adopted this post-humanist paradigm where we value other life beyond human life, and we see it as entangled with humanity and its well-being. This is a really welcome turn, but so far, I think it ultimately falls somewhat short, because this consideration of non-human animals or other life beyond our own has mostly remained on the symbolic level, and it really hasn't translated into improving the actual condition of non-human animals. So in terms of my own personal values and academic research, I want to be concerned about also the material well-being of other animals, and not just care about them symbolically. And that's also where this research and my talk today is situated. So given this unethical and unsustainable nature of animal-based food production, there is a really pressing need to rethink our food consumption and our food systems. So, and now this has been recognized also very widely by scholars, by quite mainstream international organizations. And I should highlight quite recently the Eat Lancet Commission on Food, Planet and Health published a report where they envision what they call a great food transformation, where they say that the food eaten by humans should be both healthy and sustainable, and such food is really mostly plant-based. And also plant-based foods, as we know by now, these diets are suitable and they are nutritionally adequate for human beings. So in practical terms, we could think then that perhaps veganism could be one of the potential solutions to the crisis we are facing. So this could be a way of practicing care towards non-human others, ecosystems, as well as humans. And today I'll be focusing on kind of individual practices of the vegan men I'll be speaking about. But I want to note that this transformation cannot only be achieved through individual, particularly consumption practices, but we also need quite large-scale institutional initiatives and change. And I'll come back to this point at the end if I have time. Now, I'm going to move on really to this issue of men, masculinities and care and ecology. And I will link environmental and animal justice with gender here. So we have these kind of two interlinked issues. On the one hand, we are dealing with this important question in gender and feminist research and activism about the potential for more just gender relations. So in critical studies of men and masculinities, we have for a long time paid attention to men's identities and practices in fostering more egalitarian gender relations. We are theorizing alternative forms of masculinity. So this is on the one hand. And at the same time, we have this ecological crisis, and increasingly more attention has been paid to gender in this context. And also this has included kind of concern with the role of men and masculinities. So there's now some work done on that as well. And there's this concept of ecological masculinities that was introduced by Martin Haltman and Paul Poulet. So this has been used to describe men's kind of doing of gender in ways that, on the one hand, aspire towards greater gender equality, but also then develop more ecologically sustainable ways of living. And these two aspects are seen as intertwined and cannot really be separated easily. So actually, food and eating practices are gendered in important ways and linked to men and masculinities. So there have been certain kind of practices such as meat eating, unhealthy eating, as well as distancing from household cooking that have been identified as among some key kind of food practices or cultural patterns that are associated with men and masculinities. And of particular groups of men whose everyday food practices contribute to less violent and more sustainable ways of living, I think vegan men stand out as an interesting case, and they may challenge these patterns that I just highlighted, and this may have positive implications for gender equality. And interestingly, there is some previous research on gender in the context of veganism, and this has kind of explored vegan and as well as vegetarian men and their identities and practices. And primarily this has been studied in Western contexts. And so what this research has found is that from the point of view of gender and gendered power relations, veganism actually offers some ways of doing masculinity differently. So there are particularly eco-feminist scholars. They have argued that by refraining from consuming animals and going vegan, men are disrupting the link between hegemonic masculinity and meat eating. And this is a very powerful element in dominant constructions of masculinity. So by becoming vegan, men open up avenues for negotiating new, non-normative masculinities, and they may challenge our traditional understandings of what it means to be manly. But this is kind of the more optimistic picture, but we have to be a little bit critical and cautious also about this. Some research has pointed out that while men's veganism may challenge some gendered and other power relations, it leaves others in place, or it's sort of ambiguous. It kind of does both. But still, we know relatively little about this, and that's something I'm exploring in my research. So this relationship between men's veganism and their gender and gender equality practices. Now, next, and this really relates to the topic of our conference, I want to specifically speak about care in the context of men and masculinities and men's veganism. So how is this linked to care? And here I'm inspired by ecofeminist work. These scholars have talked a lot about care, about the ethics of care. And there's this idea that we should expand our idea of care beyond anthropocentrism. So when we think of veganism, why people become vegan? So typically, there are three reasons. There are ethical reasons that concern the well-being of animals. Then there are environmental as well as health. And what I think quite well links all these aspects is the idea of care and sustaining relationships of care. So towards non-human animals, local and global ecosystems, as well as practices of self-care. So I think care is a sort of an idea that links all these aspects. So when framed through this notion of care, we could say that veganism can be thought of as a responsive or effective ethics of non-violence. And it's also, I should note, a very embodied, like everyday practice of care for non-human animals, earth, other animals, other humans, and the self. It could be at least that way. And then for men in particular, veganism offers potential to kind of engage in or strengthen their sense of care and their relationships of care. And veganism really means kind of grounding care in everyday practice. It involves demonstrating our concern for others in our material practices beyond just discursive declarations. And as we also know, care has traditionally been associated with women's lives and practices. And for men, it has been argued that sort of orientation towards care and caring is rather exceptional. Although this is changing, of course. And I think also vegan men are quite an interesting group to study in this context. And now I come really to this part of the talk where I will share some empirical insights from my own research. I'll introduce some findings to you on the potential of men's veganism to foster alternative, more egalitarian and ecological masculinities in ways that support commitments to more just gender and other power relations and to non-human life. And there are two main questions that I'll be kind of asking and trying to explore here. So how do vegan men practice care? And very crucially, whether and how is their veganism linked to social justice and gender equality? Just to give you a little bit of context, I cannot go in detail with this today, but I focus on the Nordic context where vegan men and their practices haven't been really studied so much. And I have done qualitative interviews, over 60 interviews in total, with men based in Finland and in Estonia. And I explored their stories, their narratives of going vegan and living as vegan. And I do have here on the slides a bit of information, background information about these men. They were 18 to 56 years of age, and on average, they were 34 years old. And maybe I should also note, and this is quite significant, that they were definitely a privileged group of men. They were white, they were predominantly ethnic, Estonian or Finnish, typically middle class, living in urban areas, and educated. So this is quite a unique profile, and that should be taken into account when exploring their veganism and seeing what its implications are. So in my findings, and what I'm going to kind of share now, it's divided into three intertwined aspects, and actually there are four, but I combined the two first. So I will be looking at, when I look at vegan men's practices of care, I'll explore how they practice care towards non-human life, the other animals, as well as the environment. They can be viewed separately, but here I put them together because also it is so entangled for these men, as I will be showing. Then also care for the self, so how they practice that, how they, through veganism, kind of practice care for their own selves. And then finally, for human others. So I'll be looking at their politics and practices of gender and intersectionality. But before I go into these three aspects, I want to just talk a little bit about the transition to veganism, because how did they actually get there? What were their motivations? And that also tells us something about care, I think. So these narratives of transition were quite diverse. For most, this was quite a long process and perhaps gradual. So some went vegetarian first, and for some it was also quite abrupt. So there were both kinds of ways represented. And also the context in which their veganism emerged was quite different. Some of the men were located in social settings that were more conducive to a vegan transition. For instance, they had vegan friends, family members, they had more information about veganism, but other participants in the research didn't have such favorable conditions. But despite actually those diverse experiences, there was a common theme throughout these transition narratives. And this was a gradual realization that the change is needed in one's behavior towards what was thought as a more appropriate or harmonious way of living in terms of relating to other species, ecosystems, and their own body, as well as health. So for most, this involved a recognition that the way that we treat other animals is unethical. And then they developed this desire to stop participating in this harmful practice. And for others, actually, this motivation, at least initially, had to do with their concern about their own health, in fact, what the animal products do to the body. And they had the desire to improve their health. And for a few, actually, knowledge about environmental consequences of animal farming on an industrial scale prompted them to go vegan. And what was interesting that it was typically one of these considerations, or sometimes two, that was the initial driver. But after a while, more than one, or perhaps even all of those reasons became important for them to live as a vegan. And I do have here a few quotes. I always like to illustrate my findings with quotes from the interview material. I've used the pseudonyms to refer to the research participants. And here we have the first one, Panu from Finland, who said that the ethical aspect turned me gradually to veganism. I just couldn't consume animal products anymore because I became aware of the horrors and suffering. So first it was all about ethics, and then I became more aware of the ecological consequences of animal consumption. So you here can see how the reasons also change. So it started with one, and then it moved to another, and it was a broader awareness of what's going on in this industry. And I have another quote here to illustrate this initial focus only on self-care, actually, and how this transformed into broader care for other life. So Timo here says, first, it was only for my own health, but it really changed, I think, already after being a vegetarian for half a year. It had drastically changed to rather moral or ethical reasons, really feeling with the animals. So he describes his first concern with his own health, and then actually concern for other animals. And this feeling with the animals also kind of draws attention to the emotions that he was experiencing, and that figured quite prominently in the narratives. I'll be kind of returning to that point. But now, after this, I'll really get into these three aspects I wanted to introduce here. So how did these men express or practice care for other animals and for the environment, as well as beyond? Because you'll see how for them this kind of care is broader. It can never be, or very rarely can be, just for the animals. And they made a lot of links between these different aspects. So when we we can look at how these men understood veganism, what it meant for them to really understand this aspect here. So broadly, for them, living as a vegan was considered the best or even the only acceptable way for many to live once they had become vegan. It was seen as the best way to practice non-violence and care, as well as to minimize harm as a result of one's life and choices. So to minimize harm mainly or initially towards non-human animals, but also typically towards other beings, as expressed in this quote here by Tapani, who says, "The leading idea for me is how you can minimize the harm with the resources you have." So this minimizing harm is quite a key word, or this figured really prominently. The idea of we want to minimize harm really more broadly. And even for those whose main aim was to avoid causing harm to other animals, veganism was seen as a way of contributing to a better world more broadly, a more caring and sustainable way of relating to the environment, to others, and to oneself. And here we have Eetu from Finland, who says, I knew I was doing something right and correct by not contributing to animal suffering and also not causing as much environmental impact. And then also because the way I eat or because of the vegan diet, I also knew that the Western diet can cause you a heart attack. And so by diet and lifestyle, you can really make a difference in your life and well-being. So here he comes to his own life and well-being and kind of relates this animal suffering and what happens to animals in these industries to his own life and well-being. To kind of end this section of care for other animals and the environment, I do want to share quite a long quote here because I think it's quite powerful. This is a quote by a man called Tom, who's I think it's a really powerful story that he shares. It's a powerful and emotional story of a life-changing encounter with a non-human animal. It was a really profound moment of connection that he experienced that started his path towards veganism. And here I'll share it with you. So he speaks of an experience where he was a young man, he was really a teenager, and he was traveling with his father in Southeast Asia. And he says, I was in this resort, this kind of hotel at the base, at the foot of some beautiful mountains covered in rainforest. I just went exploring and I found this concrete pool, swimming pool with the mountains behind it. And at the edge of the pool, there was a concrete cell. So it was like concrete on three sides. And on one side, there were thick metal bars. And inside, there was an orangutan. She was quite lifeless. I mean, she was obviously alive. Her hand kind of wrapped around the steel bar. She did not look at me so much as look through me. Her eyes glazed over. For all intents and purposes, she was gone. I think she was not at all engaged in the world. I would imagine even if I was able to open the bars, I doubt she would have been bothered to climb out. And that really struck me. It just hit me with an immense sadness that I felt, looking into her eyes, that felt much like my own. I identified with her as a being, not just another, in inverted commas, animal, but a being that I identified with, I related to, that I felt like. And I couldn't help but wonder what it would be like if I was in that cage. What kind of life that would be, how I would cope, how I could survive in such a situation. But looking at her, I could imagine, could be not so dissimilar to what it might be like if a human being was in such a state. So that kind of hit home in a new way, perhaps for me at the time, that, these boundaries I was drawing between myself, others, and then non-human animals was such a farcical distinction that it was really hard for me to cling on to that. I couldn't do that with all human decency. So I felt that it was not right for me to be treating animals the way I had been. So this is quite an emotional and powerful story that you could say a lot about this, but I'll leave it with you to kind of experience it and develop your own feelings and thoughts about it. But to kind of summarize this part, so veganism then was regarded as a conscious way of life and intervention to the world, rather than a lifestyle or a trend which could be adopted or rejected on a whim. So typically, these aspects, concern for other animals, environment, and the self, were entangled. And now I move on to the second point, which is about personal transformation and care for the self. So even if that wasn't the main aim, it sort of followed, or for many, this was what they practiced or cultivated through veganism. So typically for these men, going vegan was quite an important change in their lives. And for many, it was part of like a broader personal transformation. And this sometimes included things like giving up alcohol, taking better care of one's health, in some cases, some kind of even spiritual awakening, although this was quite rare. And we can't really say, or I cannot claim that veganism really triggered those things, but it's quite significant that these processes were taking place in parallel with the shift to veganism. And in some instances, going vegan was regarded as a catalyst for some of these changes. So these men recognized veganism as a kind of new normal for them in their lives. And it really became an important part of their sense of self. And they didn't see a possibility of going back. They typically noted an increased sense of awareness of what's going on in the world and openness to new knowledge, and even an emergence of a more critical mind, which was quite intertwined with an increased sense of empathy that they told me about. Here I have a quote by Timo, who says, "Veganism has made me a more empathetic person, less arrogant, less ignorant, and also this drastic change. I think that's also freeing a lot." Like liberating, he means. When you grow up in a cultural environment where it's normal that you eat meat, and then you find out it's actually wrong. I've been doing that all my life. I never questioned it. And now that I start thinking about it, I find out it's more wrong than anything else that I ever did. It's like I've been doing this completely wrong thing, like just completely bad. And I've just been doing that for years. And I had no idea because everyone is doing it. And that kind of frees yourself from your culture in a way, because you start doubting also other things around you. I became a more critical thinker towards my cultural environment, and also the government, or like towards the country I live with. So he challenged quite a lot of institutions. Nobody told me that they, he means farmed animals, have been caged and that they have never seen the sunlight. Nobody told me that. Where is the consumer protection there? The slaughterhouses should have glass walls, and then this information should be available and be provided. So I'm certainly much more critical due to the fact that I found out I have been betrayed all my life. And it kind of continues with this thread. Right, and so some of the men thought of themselves as always having been compassionate people, even prior to their vegan transition. But then by going vegan, they kind of saw this as putting their empathy and care in practice. And so veganism kind of made them more compassionate and caring. As we have a quote here from Tanel from Estonia, who says, "Well, I talk about some kind of emotions and feelings then after I decided to go vegan. I don't remember how long it took, but like this empathy or love or understanding towards animals, that increased a lot. I became much kinder. The tree that grows here is as important to the world as I am. So yes, I became more caring and loving, especially towards animals," he says. On the whole, so men overwhelmingly highlighted the emergence of a more positive sense of self, stemming from living their everyday lives in accordance with the values, contributing to a better world and systemic change. And here we have a quote from Ilmari from Finland, who says, "It was like very, very empowering. It was like you were in control of that, because it is, because I was like, oh, I'm responsible for what happens in the farms. And also, in a way, you're also not, because you are indirectly responsible. So it was empowering to be like, well, at least I'm cutting myself out of that." So this sense of responsibility was highlighted a lot, that now we can actually, we can have a say, or we can do something so that these animals wouldn't be harmed as a result of our actions. So this positive sense of self emerged as a result of caring about the lives of non-human others. So it was a form of other-directed care. And I also here, as a kind of, I think it's the last thing in this topic, I want to share how also, this is a really interesting example of how this personal transformation of going vegan was seen in gender terms. So like a development towards a more caring and emotional masculine self. Lukas from Finland says, "I feel like maybe being male and vegan, it has kind of like opened me up to these softer emotions and these kinds of things that would not be considered like necessarily as masculine features. Because I have been vegan, that is already something that sets me somewhat apart from these things. It has kind of opened space. And I've kind of seen this same thing in a lot of these vegan male friends of mine. So he kind of identifies a pattern and also sets himself apart from many other men. And he kind of says, yes, that veganism has transformed me into this more caring man who has more empathy and kind of experiencing and expressing softer emotions. I think that's quite significant. And so, in fact, just to say shortly about emotions, that they figured quite prominently in men's narratives of transitioning to veganism and their experience of living as vegan. Often it was in parallel with kind of claims that veganism, going vegan is a very rational and logical thing to do, which was also present in many narratives. But then emotions were very prominent there, as maybe you remember from Tom's story a few slides ago. So men spoke of strong emotional and visceral reactions they experienced when witnessing cruelty towards non-human animals. The emotions cited also included anger and frustration as well, particularly initially when they learned about this industry and its consequences. So the expression of empathy has traditionally, of course, been associated with women. And I think vegan men's accounts of relating to non-human animals are a compelling illustration of how empathy is cultivated and practiced by men. Okay, so now I come to the kind of last aspect here that I want to open up before I wrap this up. And this concerns care for human others more particularly. And in my research, and this is something I'm still studying and kind of working through, I want to learn something about vegan men's gender and intersectional politics and practices. So this actually is quite an important aspect, whether and how vegan men link veganism to gender and other social justice causes. And it's part of definitely this term of ecological masculinities. And I identified in my study two main ways in which these connections were made. And I'll first start with the first one. So where veganism was explicitly regarded as part of a broader agenda of social justice, part of one's egalitarian values and progressive politics. And here I also share some quotes with you. And first is by Veli-Matti from Finland, who says, basically it's the same thing. Racism, violence, speciesism, veganism, like they all go together. I don't see different being violent to humans or animals. So he sees violence as interconnected, and he takes this very intersectional kind of perspective and seeing these forms of oppression as all really linked and connected, and like that we have to deal with them kind of together, so we can't really separate them. Also, transitioning to veganism was seen as expanding one's understanding of interlinked forms of oppression. Here we have Marcus from Estonia, who says, veganism makes you very sensitive to injustice towards animals. It's a thing of privilege. We're in such a privileged position in relation to animals that we have taken the right to call them things. This idea of superiority has been unpleasant to me since I was a child. Someone taking a position of authority, not because of their worth, but for some other reason. For example, in relations between men and women, I have already observed this before my veganism. Often men want to show women their place. So here he challenges kind of hierarchies, and he challenges our privilege as human beings, but also perhaps his own privilege as a man. And he links those issues of kind of this idea of superiority that we have towards animals, but then also he brings in gender inequality specifically. So so this kind of, I have a few more quotes I want to share, which I think are quite telling. So the emergence of a more critical perspective on society upon going vegan was really seen as helping to develop an awareness of different forms of injustice among human beings. So quite interesting that you kind of first directed your attention towards the concerns of animals, other animals, and then you became more sensitive to questions about inequalities in human societies. So here is Nico from Finland, that first quote on the slide, who says, maybe it's kind of that's one thing that's kind of made me question more, also about other things, kind of examine my values, and not just doing things that other people are doing, and that's okay. Look more critically at things, like, for example, the gender issue. I used to be more ambivalent about it, or at least that doesn't concern me, so I don't have to think about it. So I would say that it has also had an influence on that. So he kind of specifically recognizes that he's become more aware about those gender issues. And here I want to kind of make a little bit the distinction that it was typical for some Finnish research participants in particular to really explicitly see veganism as part of their kind of a broader set of values and politics, such as pacifism, non-violence, anti-racism, pro-feminism, and they, many of them had these values even before going vegan. And these men challenged hierarchies and unjust power relations, and they sought to better understand and examine their own male privilege. And typically they were had a quite distinct profile. They had social science, including gender studies degrees. They lived in biggest Finnish cities, and their social circles were kind of composed of people with very similar leftist political leanings. And also this illustrates to me how some social and cultural contexts are more conducive to the emergence of veganism and linking it to the wider social justice agenda. Because in Finland, compared to Estonia, there are kind of different gender norms and I could say more equal gender relations, and that definitely enables also men to practice masculinity in ways that is maybe more egalitarian and alternative. And also an interesting thing was that these vegan men most of them the Finnish men had opted out from the compulsory military service in Finland and chosen the civilian service, which was a decision that preceded their veganism and aligned with their pacifist ideas. We have Lucas here who says, ever since I kind of started having some kind of political consciousness, the main idea for pretty much all my beliefs is that I don't want to cause any unnecessary harm to anyone. So veganism goes in line with that, as well as doing this civilian service and all my other political beliefs as well. So we see kind of this package of like his views, and this included pacifism, not harming animals or other beings. Okay, and then this civilian service that they opted for typically actually involved some form of care work. This was seen quite an important kind of turning point in their lives. And then I want to present the last quote on this slide by Gordon from Finland. And so this kind of illustrates this idea that men who explicitly identified as pro-feminist and embraced an intersectional agenda, they also tended to express critical views on masculinity or some forms of masculinity. So here Gordon kind of talks about this toxic masculinity. He says, I think toxic masculinity is damaging, not just for animals, but also for women, for, people of different sexual preference. I see these all connected, and it's a big problem for a lot of different beings on this planet when men think that they have to be this way and are raised to be this way. I think it's harmful to a lot of different creatures because all creatures on this planet deserve respect, freedom, and equality. So I think this nicely summarizes the kind of ideas of kind of linking all these different kinds of oppressions. And now there was also a second way of kind of relating to gender and intersectionality, which kind of outwardly seems a bit more pessimistic. So these men didn't make connections between veganism and other social justice causes, or maybe they saw these connections as unimportant. And for a few, veganism and animal justice were deliberately kind of seen as separate issues. They were not to be linked. And we have here Peter from Estonia who says, I would totally keep them separate. I somehow understand this connection, but I think it's a thing that would alienate men from veganism, he means. I mean, if you put them all together, then if you are vegan, you always have to be a feminist and to support gay rights, etc. It would be great if people were like this. But even if someone wants to be all that and agrees to all this, but if you ask them to commit to all this, they would say, hey, that's too much for me. I see this connection and why there's a synergy there, but I think they should be thought of as a separate issue. So he kind of like, his own position in this is kind of ambiguous. He kind of says like, well, I understand this and I would want it to be this way, that these issues would be interlinked, but then maybe society is not ready for that, he kind of implies here. But I want to say that, however, even those who did not explicitly identify as pro-feminist or didn't practice intersectional politics recognized in some form or another the links between masculinity and meat eating and gender stereotypes that prevent a lot of men from going vegan. And also, many men, including those who didn't explicitly associate those issues, they shared some kind of mostly negative experiences of standing out as vegan in kind of masculine work environments and among non-vegan male friends. And in these narratives, they typically presented themselves as different from other men, more aware, more caring, and distancing themselves from this kind of what they saw as toxic forms of masculinity. So yes, so even those men who positioned themselves, who didn't want to kind of link themselves with pro-feminism, admitted to having developing kind of more empathetic and caring selves through relating to non-human animals and their suffering. Okay, I do have quite a little time left, and I do want to now attempt to wrap this up. So I have, in today's talk, engaged with some quite important issues and linked them. So issues of gender, social change, sustainable food practices, and human-animal relations in this age of the Anthropocene. And I have explored how, to use Martin Haltman and Paul Poulet's term, how ecological masculinities might look like in more concrete terms through the framework of veganism. I was drawing on the narratives of vegan men in Finland and Estonia. And I examined men's veganism through the notion of care. So care towards non-human animals, environment, other human beings and the self. And some or all these forms of care were either consciously pursued by the men in this study, or they also sometimes emerged kind of more inadvertently through their vegan praxis. And as you saw here and what I presented, men considered going vegan as a significant and positive change in their lives. And often this process of transformation started with some kind of recognition that a change is needed in how one relates to others, to animals, the environment, or their own health. And as I pointed out, it was typical for one of these aspects to be the main driver for going vegan, but then later other aspects became important. And also I kind of highlighted some of the kind of consequences for these men for going vegan. So a kind of greater awareness, a sense of openness and a more critical mind. And as well as then kind of becoming more caring and empathetic. So, and I also did highlight then a kind of a little bit difference between Estonia and Finland in this one aspect of like, do you connect those oppressions, the inequalities and oppressions in human societies with the oppression of animals? And in Finland, that was done more than in Estonia. But then, as I also kind of tried to point out, you can't very well neatly separate these men because inadvertently even they contribute to kind of more caring relations towards other beings. And then overall, I suggest that for men, veganism could serve as one concrete way to perform care and ultimately contribute to the emergence of more ecological masculinities. But just kind of finally, the seemingly kind of transformative potential of men's veganism, I think it also needs some critical engagement alongside with this more optimistic picture that I've painted here. And a crucial question to ask is whether and to what extent men's veganism as an individual practice, which first and foremost is enacted through consumerism, translates into broader social and institutional change in terms of both altering human-animal relations and gender power relations. I'll kind of a little bit talk about the second more, but definitely there are these issues that through this kind of capitalist consumerism, there are we should be critical about the possibilities to challenge, for instance, the capitalist system that produces a lot of inequalities, including gender equality. But then regarding the potential for changing gender relations, despite this evidence of kind of alternative ways of doing masculinity by these vegan men in kind of micro settings, it is unclear whether and how these alternative gender practices ultimately actually challenge these men's privileged position in the gender system and in the social hierarchy more broadly. So it could be that by doing masculinity in different ways, vegan men may change the content of hegemonic masculinity, but they are less likely to shake men's hegemony itself. So as I've pointed out, the men in my study were privileged in terms of gender, race and class, and then these privileges enabled them to transition to veganism more easily compared to less privileged men, I would suggest. And in some cases, maybe this kind of privilege even as going vegan as a privileged men, it may even bolster their kind of masculinity. It could be. But this is an issue that I'm going to explore further in my research. But despite these limitations, I suggest that veganism is a tangible way in which men can begin to practice care for human and non-human others, the earth and themselves, and thereby move towards more ecological masculinities. There is a need for particularly privileged Western men to cultivate more empathetic, kinder and caring ways of being and relating to all life. This is because they are a powerful social group who are most responsible for climate change. And this is a necessity in these urgent times of escalating crisis. And given that oppressions are interlinked, social and environmental justice cannot be achieved without animal justice. This means we must extend our care to other species beyond our own. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this food for thought.